Good morning and afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. This is Kevin Bemmel, and I'm the host of The Way to Wow, Business Lessons from the Military. We're at our new time starting this week, 11 a.m. Tuesday, 2 p.m., 11 a.m. Tuesday Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, and then, as I always say, an hour in for Central and Mountain time. And we discuss military doctrine, history, great leaders, all by way of distilling from them or from this information, lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional lives to increase our success. And for the last few weeks, we've been talking about what happened? I just lost my notes here. Here we go. We've been talking about the nature of business based on Marine Corps doctrine about the nature of warfare. And starting this week, we're going to deal with the theory of war as it is applied to business. So I actually touched on one of these topics, or not touched on, but dealt with one of these topics a few weeks ago. I'm going to start with just a very quick review of that show, and then we're going to move on, and we're going to spend the next several weeks talking about these various concepts and how we can use them. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Moment. And there we go. Okay. One of these days, it's all going to go smoothly. Okay. So here we are, The Way to Wow, Business Lessons for the Military. And as always, this relates to the 3 pillars of attainment. We're dealing here in the pursuits pillar, in the finances realm, and you'll see how they sometimes apply to others. So, theory of war applied to business. So a few weeks ago, I talked about the levels of activity, and we described them as strategic, operational, and tactical. Strategic being the sort of top level at which we're dealing. It's as its name says, it's the strategy we're using in order to make our business successful. Operational then are the different modes through which we're going to put that strategy into action. And then the tactical level is the sort of day-to-day activities that we're performing in order to work those modes that align with our strategic vision for our business. So if you want to hear more about the levels of activity, go to our YouTube channel, and you can find this show, and we'll talk about that more. So for today, here we go. We're going to talk about actions. So our actions, business does not happen without actions. Our careers do not develop without actions. And as I say that, I'm reminded of the wonderful show that I think I've mentioned before, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. Right? And one of the characters there, his whole plan for success is to not take action, to stay below the radar, because in his mind, taking action is coupled with potentially taking the wrong action and getting fired. And all he cares about is not getting fired, right? So for that particular employee, he's not following the strategic vision for the business. He has one strategy, one operational mode, and all of his tactics align with it. And that is, no matter what happens, he will still be there at the company. That's the lyric from the song. And if everyone in our businesses acted that way, the business would fail, right? So without action, there is no business, whether it's your business, whether it's a company you're working for, or for that matter, even a nonprofit. Without activity, without actions, nothing's going to happen. So there are, in fact, really only two actions that we can take in war and also in business. And that is, we can take the initiative, or we can respond to an initiative that someone else has taken. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk about this in a war context first off. Generally speaking, in a war, to win, we have to take the initiative. Okay. If we wait for the enemy to take the initiative, inevitably we're going to be set back on our heels. Okay. Now, we need to be a little bit careful here about how we define taking the initiative, because you'll see below that I have the terms offense and then defense and counterattack. Okay. The initiative isn't always taking offensive action. Okay. So if you look at the Battle of Midway, okay, the Japanese were initiating the battle. They were attacking Midway. But because the U.S. Navy had broken, the U.S. Navy had broken their code, and they knew that they were going to be attacking Midway. Indeed, although they were really on the defensive, they were able to take the initiative in defending themselves. And that may sound a little bit strange, but indeed, that's how the battle worked out. And so the Japanese, thinking they were launching a surprise attack, in fact, turned around, and the surprise of the defense and the depth of the defense was such that the Japanese Imperial Navy was defeated. Okay, so when we talk about initiative, I want to be clear. We're not always talking about taking action ahead of everybody else. Sometimes being ahead of everybody else isn't necessarily the best plan, especially in business. Okay. Would it have been the best plan at Midway for the U.S. Navy to sort out and destroy the invading Japanese fleet? And the answer probably is no, because the U.S. Navy at that point was a weaker force in the Pacific, certainly. And if they were pursuing the Japanese Navy without the support of Midway Island as what is sometimes referred to in World War II as kind of a stationary aircraft carrier, right? It was a place from which planes could be launched and recovered. It's I don't want to say it's unlikely, but it's not at all clear that the United States would have won that battle. Okay. So the same thing applies to us in business. Okay. We either are going to be taking the initiative in business, or we're going to be responding to someone else taking the initiative. Okay. And let's take a famous example of this. Okay. So this is going back quite a number of decades ago. I want to say maybe 30 decades, 30 years, about 3 decades, maybe more. Coca-Cola came out with what is now infamously known as New Coke. So the New Coke recipe, at least to my taste buds, was sweeter than what came to be called classic Coke recipe. And that was aimed to be an initiative to engage younger consumers who seem to be liking Pepsi more, and because Pepsi, I guess, is sweeter. I'm not a Pepsi drinker, but different taste buds differ. But in any event, Coca-Cola took that initiative, and it turned out to be a horrible idea. I mean, they were just pounded. Okay. So they would have been much better off either um, waiting to see how the competition really was coming out between them and Pepsi. Was it going to be durable? Number one, and number two, did they really need to change Coca-Cola, or should they have brought out a new product that was sort of like Coca-Cola Sweet or whatever you want to call it, right? So in any event, those of you who know the story, they very quickly, after they brought out new Coke, brought out what they called classic Coke, which was the original Coca-Cola. And after a few years at most, new Coke went away. That initiative disappeared, and they went back to just the original Coca-Cola recipe. Okay, so they were trying to get ahead of the market, so to speak, or get a jump on the competition in the market by taking the offensive initiative. And that turned out not to be the right strategy for Coca-Cola, at least at that time. Okay, so in business, and this is why business is so difficult, right? When do we take the initiative, and how do we take the initiative? Now, it is generally speaking true that companies that take the initiative are the ones that are successful. They're the innovators. They're the ones who are actively out there seeking new clients, seeking new customers. And so we do, in general, want to default to being on the initiative always, okay? The crucial distinction is, how do we want to be taking the initiative, okay? Because if you look at businesses that wait for, that just sort of cruise along until something happens that they then have to respond to. I'm thinking of, for example, passenger rail service. The railroads, they saw no threat coming from either buses or airplanes. They thought, hey, people have been taking the trains for decades and decades and decades. At that point, close to 100 years, I think. And so, there's no need for us to innovate. And indeed, what ended up happening is passenger rail service was virtually wiped out. We still have Amtrak, but Amtrak has not been a profitable business, I don't think, ever in its existence. There are certain parts of Amtrak, like the Acela line in the Northeast, that are profitable, but overall, Amtrak is not a profitable venture, right? And part of the reason is they didn't take the initiative. So the railroads were not in the passenger rail and the freight rail business. They were actually in the transportation business, and they probably should have branched out into bus lines and perhaps even into airlines and created some sort of integrated ability to travel that would have taken advantage of these new modes of transportation, right? They didn't take the initiative. They sat back, and by the time they realized what was going on, they could only respond, and the response in the end was not effective. And so, like I said, passenger service has, for all intents and purposes, it's irrelevant in the people moving part of the transportation section. Okay, will it rebuild? It's hard to say. In Europe, of course, train travel is integrated into the way people move. Here in the United States, that's just not the case anymore. So how do we deal with this then? So as we are putting together the strategic plans for our businesses, we need to be thinking, how can we be taking the initiative in various areas of our business? And then that may include marketing, it may include product development, it may include responding to the competition, or not responding is the wrong word, because I'm trapping you into thinking it's okay to wait to respond. It's, let's say, dealing with the competition. Okay. Am I suggesting you engage in, industrial espionage? No, but of course, open source, track your competitors, know what they're doing, and look to stay, if not at least on par with them, hopefully a step or two ahead of them. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, let's stick with our transportation business example. Let's look at what airlines are doing these days. So, excuse me. One of the things most of the legacy carriers are doing, because again, they ended up kind of behind the curve, and upstarts like Southwest and Alaska and these other carriers made big inroads into their business. So they've invested heavily in a number of different technologies. One of them is air taxis. So I know United Airlines has invested, I believe it's in two air taxi companies. American Airlines has invested in them as well. And they're looking, how do we deal with what is inevitably going to be this, or what appears to inevitably going to be this new business that in theory could take away from our short haul routes, right? So I think the airlines are looking at it from the standpoint of, well, rather than letting this pass us by, let's be involved with it. Let's be involved in the discussions about how this works and integrate it into our overall plans for continuing to be at the forefront of the transportation business. Okay, so that's one way they're dealing with it. Another way is they're looking at alternatives for fueling their aircraft. Okay, and so I think they're looking at I can't think of hydrogen. I believe as a fuel in lieu of petroleum-based fuels, and they're working with airliner manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus, and engine makers, Rolls-Royce, etc., Lockheed, and figuring out how do we drive forward with more efficient, less polluting means of flying our aircraft. And again, it's taking that initiative. And I don't know any of the people who run these airlines, but I could imagine that they're having discussions frequently on how do we keep up with these trends? How do we take advantage of them? And analyzing and getting involved with this startup or this company or that company, and then analyzing how do we think this one's going to play out in practice, knowing that out of 10 investments, probably only one is going to pay off. That's how it works in the startup world. Okay, so now here's the thing. If we think of it being on the initiative as only being on the offense, eventually we're going to hit a point of fatigue. We can't always be driving forward. And after a prolonged drive forward, we may need to kind of rest and regroup. Now, some of you are out there saying, wait a minute, I thought you were a big Patton aficionado. Patton would never stop and regroup. Well, that's not exactly the case. I mean, there were certainly times when Patton had to regroup. Typically, it was when the enemy was pushing back so hard that his aggressive advancement just stopped. Okay. Now, in business where the end results are not as immediately existential as they are in war, it may not be as important, it probably is not as important for us to constantly be driving our people forward. So there probably will be appropriate times for us to, we'll get to a certain point. Now let's evaluate where we're at. What directions are we going into? Are we heading into? Which ones appear to be fruitful? Which ones don't? Probably shed some of the the ones that don't appear to be likely to pay dividends in the future, redirect our forces and get ready for the next offensive initiative put forward. And in doing so, we take some rest, and we may need to initiate some defensive maneuvers. Okay, and we see companies doing this quite often. So, for example, when Instagram started becoming quite popular, at least partly at the expense of Facebook, Facebook had a couple of choices. They could initiate a direct competitor to Instagram, and if memory serves, I think they even tried to do that, and it didn't really work. And so what they did was they ended up buying Instagram and making it part of kind of a suite of social media services that are now under this umbrella called Meta. So that's really a defensive and counterattack form of initiative. Okay, so by buying Instagram, they were defending themselves against it intruding and potentially overtaking their business, and they did it. They defended themselves by, in essence, counterattacking and grabbing their competitor, and that happens in lots of businesses. I'll give you a much smaller example. So, a number of years ago, I want to say now it's probably a good 5 to 8 years ago, there was a kosher wine that was available at Trader Joe's. There was a Tempranillo. It was called Terranol. Terranol was the winemaker, and it was from Spain or Italy, and it was very inexpensive. $4 to $5 a bottle, which is that's what Trader Joe's, especially at that time, really excelled at, was finding good products at a very low price point. And people bought it by the case. I know I did. And we drank it all the time, and it was good, especially when you consider it was half the cost of its nearest competitor. Okay, and it was starting to steal market share from its big competitor. So one day I show up to do my regular Trader Joe's shopping, and it was gone. I'm like, wow, that's weird. They must be out of it. And over the next several weeks, it never came back. It was never on the shelves ever again. I've never seen it since then. So finally, one day I was talking to one of the wine reps at Trader Joe's, and I asked him, I said, whatever happened to it? And he said, the rumor is that this big kosher wine company bought it because it was eating into their business and then closed it. Right? So it was a defensive move on their part by counterattacking, but taking it even one step further and just closing it down. So whatever they paid for it, evidently it was worth it to then just shut down the operation. Now, one would have thought, hey, just keep it going, put it under your label, and you have this new lower price point. But I guess their idea was, if this doesn't exist, people will have to buy the more expensive product, right? And that happens from the larger companies' perspective. It evidently may, look to them like smart business. From a consumer standpoint, it was a shame because we lost a very, low cost, good product. That's how business goes. Okay. So, like I said, when we're dealing with actions, we do want to be taking the initiative, but taking the initiative doesn't always mean taking the offense. Sometimes we need to sit on defense, right? Sometimes we can see a competitor taking what they think is going to be a really bright initiative, and it's going to wipe us out. And as we analyze it, we determine, nope, they're going to fall flat on their face, right? So do we want to take some kind of initiative to try and overrun them? Or are we better taking the initiative to sit back on defense and letting them crash and burn? Right? It was their decision. We're not under any obligation to rescue our competitors if they're doing something that we think is a bad business decision. Okay. And we don't even necessarily need to counterattack. We can just, you know what? Let's let this play out for them. Okay. Blows up. Okay. And now we can go back to taking the initiative. Okay. So, or taking the offensive initiative is really the more correct way to put it. Okay. In general, between the two choices for action we have, initiative and response, we don't want to be on the response, okay? Because then we're typically going to be scrambling, figuring out what do we do to stay competitive? How do we deal with this latest shift in the market? How do we deal with this most recent change in product offerings that compete with us? So we want to be looking forward, we want to be acting forward, and we want to be pushing forward, like General Patton talks about. However, there are times when being on the offensive is not going to be the right course of action. And so we are better off taking a defensive pause and either using that to sort of let the competitor come in so that we can counterattack, or just letting their initiative peter out, okay, maybe for lack of money, maybe for lack of there actually being a market there for it, but whatever it is that we've analyzed that will make their initiative fail, let that happen. And then, we don't need to waste, for example, marketing dollars trying to fight it. We're better off husbanding our resources so that once that one fails, now we can just leapfrog over them while they sit back and figure out what happened here. We had this great initiative and it didn't work, and we go merrily on our way, right? While they have to deal with the losses from taking a poorly conceived initiative. Okay, and you can see the same thing happening. A direct correlation to how things happen in war. That's why I particularly like this particular aspect of the theory of war applied to business. It's virtually a one-to-one correlation in how you would apply it. And so when you're watching, an old war movie or something like that, or a TV show, look at how they're acting within the battles, within the tactical battles, the operational scheme, the strategic level. Think about, analyze those, and how might this work out in my business? Play that game, in your mind, sort of business game. We call it war gaming, right? In the military, business game in your mind based on what you're seeing. Is there a lesson there that you can pull out and apply to your business? So this is what I have for you today in our next series on Marine Corps warfighting doctrine applied to business, the theory of war. And we will be back next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, an hour in for Central and Mountain time, to discuss the next group, the next part of the theory of war applied to business. We'll be doing this for the next few weeks. And I invite you to watch tomorrow, the Way to Wow show, People Making Money. And always interesting guests and ideas about how we can better position ourselves for professional success, as well as invest better and build our financial success, build our wealth in a more efficient way. Now, starting next week actually, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here for a minute. And here it is. Starting next week on I don't see where the time is. Oops. Well, okay. So starting next week on March 8th, I will be launching my third show, and this is going to be how to work with a professional fiduciary. So this is one of the business activities I conduct. It's a new business activity for me in terms of being a licensed professional fiduciary, although I have done work like this for the last few years that I didn't need to be licensed for, and have done very similar work for many, many years before that. So if you are interested in dealing with trusts and estates, with special needs trusts, and the kinds of issues, whether they be real estate, whether they be financial services issues, whether they be management issues, agreement issues, personality issues, all of those things that play into working with a professional fiduciary and the people who they essentially represent, do join me starting on May 8th. It'll be a weekly show. That's on Monday. And we will discuss those issues and figure out ways we can work together on them. And so that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for joining me. And it just leaves me to remind her, Marie, darling, you are my belle. So thanks very much, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow and next week.